I walked into the living room, still damp from the shower, and stopped dead in my tracks. Lisa, my wife, was sitting on the couch with another man, laughing, touching, kissing him. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I could barely process what was happening right in front of my eyes. She didn't even notice me standing there at first. Her focus was entirely on him. She leaned in, whispering something in his ear before locking lips with him again, deepening the kiss. It wasn't a quick peck. It wasn't a moment of carelessness. It was a full, passionate kiss that told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't move. The world around me was spinning, but all I could do was watch as my wife, the woman I had trusted, betrayed me in front of my eyes. Finally, she pulled away from the kiss, her eyes meeting mine. But there was no guilt, no shame. Just a cold, indifferent look, like I was some stranger in my own home. Lisa. I managed to say, though my voice barely escaped my throat. What the hell is going on? She looked at me, as if she was bored by the whole thing. Oh, Dan, she said, almost condescendingly. This is Ryan. My friend. Ryan didn't even flinch. He stood up, giving me a smug smile, as if everything was completely normal. Hey man, he said casually, offering his hand. I didn't take it. I couldn't. Lisa, still sitting there, crossed her legs and looked at me with that same indifferent expression. I'm done, Dan. All of this, she motioned around the room, it's over. I didn't even know how to respond. How do you argue with that? How do you confront someone who has already made up their mind? You've been lying to me, I said, the words coming out more as a statement than a question. She shrugged. It's not lying, Dan. It's just, not telling you the full truth. You wouldn't understand. I stood there, completely numb. I wanted to yell, I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I had to process it. I had to see if this was even real. But it wasn't just real, it was worse than I could have imagined. She didn't care. There was no remorse. There was no apology. Lisa, the woman I had shared my life with, had moved on, and I was nothing but an afterthought. Ryan, who had been standing off to the side, stepped closer and slapped me on the back like we were old buddies. Good luck with that, man, he said, walking toward the door. As he left, Lisa turned back to me. I'll be back later tonight. Don't wait up. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me there, standing in the middle of the living room, watching her walk out the door. The weight of everything crashing down on me. I stood there, the door slamming behind her, still frozen in place. The house felt empty, the silence crushing. The soft echo of the door's impact was all I could hear for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened. The kiss. The indifference in her eyes. Lisa wasn't the woman I thought she was. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. The screen lit up with messages. But I didn't care about the texts. I didn't care about anything but the overwhelming urge to confront her. I had to know. I had to understand how this could happen. How she could do this to me. I quickly dialed her number. It rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. My heart was pounding, waiting for her to pick up. On the 4th ring, I was about to hang up, but then there it was, the sound of her voice. Dan, she answered, her tone light, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just kissed another man in our living room. Is everything okay? I didn't speak immediately. I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, clogged with anger and disbelief. I took a deep breath and forced them out. No, Lisa. Everything is not okay. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her shift, maybe sit down, her breath slightly uneven. What do you mean? What's wrong? You really want to know what's wrong? I shot back, my voice rising without control. You're sitting there, with that guy, kissing him, and you're asking me what's wrong. Her response was cool. Detached. I don't know what you're talking about, Dan. I'm just out with a friend. It's nothing. My entire body tensed. A friend? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call him? A friend? I could hear her sigh on the other end. Dan, we've been through this before. It's nothing. You're overreacting. Overreacting. That's what she thought. It was nothing. That was her explanation for everything. I had spent years with this woman. This was nothing. Lisa, I saw it. I saw you kissing him, I said, my voice steady now, as the reality of it all settled in. And don't lie to me. Don't try to cover it up. I know what happened. So, what's going on? Tell me the truth. There was another long pause. For a moment, I thought she might actually say something real. Something honest. But instead, I heard her laugh. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was a short, mocking sound. Dan, you really are pathetic, you know that, she said, almost too casually. I don't owe you anything anymore. You're so wrapped up in your feelings, in your little world, that you can't see the truth. We've been drifting apart for a long time now. This is just how it is. I felt like I had been slapped. Those words, they stung in a way I couldn't describe. I had spent years believing in us. In her. And now, here she was, telling me that everything was just, nothing. That I had been too blind to see the truth. So, what, you just gave up on us? I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She didn't answer right away. I could hear her breathing, like she was trying to decide how best to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. Yeah, I guess I did. You never paid attention to me, Dan. You were always too busy with work. I needed something more. And Ryan, he gave that to me. He actually sees me. I didn't know how to respond to that. I felt a wave of anger and confusion crash over me. She was blaming me. After everything, she was blaming me. Is this what you really want, Lisa? I asked, my voice low. To throw everything away? To destroy what we had over a fling with some guy? I didn't want to hear her answer. I didn't want to hear the words that were about to come out of her mouth. But she spoke anyway, as if there was no stopping her. Dan, stop being dramatic. It's not a fling. It's the reality. I've moved on. It's over. We're done. We're done. Those words hit me like a freight train. She was done with me. I couldn't wrap my head around it. It didn't make sense. We had a life together. A history. But none of that mattered to her. To her, I was just a thing of the past. A useless man who couldn't give her what she needed. I felt my chest tighten as I fought back the tears. No matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't stop. She had taken everything. My trust. My love. My future. All of it was gone in a moment. I don't know who you are anymore, Lisa, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I really don't. There was no apology. There was no remorse in her voice. Only the coldness of someone who had already moved on. I'm sorry you feel that way, Dan, she said flatly. But there's nothing more to say. Goodbye. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling like I had just been dropped into an abyss. The woman I loved, the woman I had spent my life with, was gone. And she didn't even care. The sound of the dial tone echoed in my ear long after the call ended, but it didn't even register. I stood there in the middle of the living room, my phone in my hand, as the words she said replayed over and over in my mind. "We're done." Those 3 words were all I could hear. My body felt like it was in a fog, everything spinning, and I had no idea what to do with myself. I had to get out of the house. I couldn't stay here, not after hearing that. I didn't know what was worse, the way she casually dropped the bomb on me or the fact that I could still hear her voice in my head, so indifferent to the destruction she'd caused. My legs felt like lead as I walked towards the front door, the reality of the situation crushing down on me like a ton of bricks. I reached for my jacket and rushed out, barely even aware of what I was doing. The fresh night air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear my mind. My thoughts were still clouded, swirling with confusion, anger, and disbelief. How could she just walk away from everything so easily? How could she destroy us with such ease, without a second thought? I slammed my fist into the steering wheel as I sat in my car, trying to figure out what to do next. I had never been so furious in my life. It wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't just the fact that she'd kissed another man, that she'd given herself to him. It was the way she dismissed me, like I was nothing. Like I didn't matter at all. How could I have been so blind? How had I not seen this coming? All the late nights she'd spent out, the little white lies, the distance between us, none of it had meant anything. I had ignored the warning signs, hoping that everything would be fine, that she'd come back to me. But she didn't. She never would. I drove aimlessly, not caring where I was going. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I tried to calm the storm inside my head. Every thought was a mixture of rage and pain, each one fighting to come to the surface. It was like being trapped inside my own head, surrounded by chaos, but no way to escape it. I pulled into a parking lot outside of a bar, one I'd gone to with Jake before. The lights were dim, the place almost empty. Perfect for what I needed. I wasn't ready to go home, not yet. Not while the anger was still so raw, so fresh. I needed to drown it out. I needed to feel something other than the burning rage in my chest. As I walked inside, the sharp scent of alcohol hit me. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too heavy. I sat at the bar, ordering a drink, and let the cool liquid slide down my throat. It burned, but it was the only thing that offered me even a small amount of relief from the mess my life had become. The bartender gave me a sympathetic look but didn't say anything. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, not with anyone. I wanted to forget. I wanted to forget everything about Lisa, about what she'd done to me. But the more I tried to block her out, the more her face kept coming back to me. Her cold, indifferent eyes. The way she didn't care. The way she tossed our life together aside like it was nothing. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for a reason to finally walk away. And now, she had it. I slammed the glass on the bar, frustrated, as the bartender raised an eyebrow. "You alright, man?" "Yeah," I muttered, not really wanting to explain myself. "Just, had a rough night." He nodded but didn't push any further. I was grateful for that. I didn't want anyone's pity. I didn't want anyone's concern. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why. Why she'd done this to me. Why she'd lied. Why she had acted like she cared when she obviously didn't. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. But when I opened them again, my mind was still on her, on everything she had done. I could feel the anger rising again, sharp and unrelenting. I didn't know how much more I could take. How much more of this, of her, I could handle. I stood up abruptly, leaving my drink unfinished. I couldn't stay here. Not when my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions that I couldn't control. I needed to find a way to confront her. I needed to see her face. I needed to make her understand. I didn't know how long I'd been driving, but I found myself back at the house. It was dark, the lights off, and the place felt even colder than before. Lisa's car was gone. She was still out with him. I could feel it in my gut. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She had already checked out of this marriage, and I had no idea how to get her back. I stood there in the driveway, my eyes on the house, and I realized something: there was no coming back from this. She wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to apologize. She had already made up her mind. The house that had once been our home felt so foreign now. It felt like a place I no longer belonged. I turned away from the house, my mind still swirling with anger. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I didn't know how to fix this, or even if it was possible to fix. All I knew was that everything had changed. And that change was permanent. The night felt like it was never going to end. I sat in my car, staring at the front of the house, my mind racing, trying to find some semblance of clarity. Every time I thought I had a grip on things, another wave of anger would hit me, and my thoughts would spiral all over again. I could feel the weight of the world pressing down on my chest, the anger, the confusion, the hurt. I had no idea what to do. I had tried to convince myself that maybe Lisa's actions didn't mean the end, that somehow, I could salvage what we had. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was not just a temporary lapse in judgment. This was her decision. She had made up her mind, and I was left holding the broken pieces. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked down and saw Jake's name on the screen. He had been there for me through so much, and I wasn't about to let this slip by without talking to him. Maybe he could offer some insight, maybe he would have some words that would make me feel like I wasn't completely losing my mind. I answered the call, my voice hoarse. Jake. Dan, where the hell are you, man? I've been trying to reach you all night. You okay? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. I'm fine, I replied, my tone sharp. I just needed some time to think. Think about what? Jake pressed. About Lisa? About what she did to you? I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him everything that had happened, but another part of me didn't want to face the reality. I didn't want to admit that everything was falling apart. Finally, I spoke. She's with him, Jake. She's really with him. I saw them together. I heard her say it. She's done with me. Jake sighed on the other end. Man, I don't know what to say. I've been trying to warn you for a while now, but I didn't think it would go this far. Don't, I said quickly, cutting him off. Don't say it. I can't hear it right now. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward from this. There was a long pause before Jake finally spoke again. I get it, man. I really do. But listen, you've got to make a decision. This whole mess, it's eating you up. You can't keep sitting around waiting for her to change her mind. You're better than this. His words were hard to hear, but deep down, I knew he was right. I couldn't keep living like this, with her lies hanging over me, with the betrayal eating me alive. I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. The truth was there, staring me in the face, and I couldn't ignore it. You're right, I muttered. I don't know what I was expecting. But I need to make a decision. Jake's voice softened. I'm here for you, man. Whatever you decide. But don't waste any more time on someone who doesn't respect you. I knew he was speaking from the heart, but the words were harder to accept than I'd imagined. Lisa hadn't just disrespected me, she had destroyed everything we had built together. The trust, the love, the future we'd planned, it was all gone. And now, I had to decide if I was going to fight for it or walk away. As I sat there in my car, looking at the empty driveway, I thought about the past few years. How many times had I worked late, thinking I was doing the right thing, thinking I was building a future for us? How many times had I missed the signs, ignored the little things that should have clued me in. I had spent so much time trying to be the good husband, the provider, that I had completely overlooked the woman I was supposed to be building my life with. And now, she was gone. And I was left to pick up the pieces. My phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Lisa. My stomach churned as I read it. "I'm sorry it ended like this. I'm not coming back, Dan. I hope you understand." The words felt like a slap in the face, but I wasn't surprised. She had made her choice. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that if I didn't take control now, I would never be able to heal. I could keep fighting for someone who didn't want to fight for me, or I could let go and take the first step toward rebuilding my life. I wiped my face with my hand, feeling the exhaustion of the past few hours weigh on me. I couldn't stay in this cycle anymore. It was time to let go. It was time to walk away. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward an uncertain future. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't keep waiting for a woman who had already checked out. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, just like the life I had been living. But with every mile, I started to feel something else: freedom. Maybe this was the first step toward healing. Maybe this was my chance to move forward, even if I didn't know where I was headed. I wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my life. The decision had been made. And now, I could begin again. The drive felt endless, as if I were trapped in a perpetual loop of uncertainty. I wasn't headed anywhere in particular, I just needed to get away from everything. From the house, from Lisa, from the betrayal that now defined my reality. The streetlights blurred as I passed, casting long shadows across the road. It felt like the world had stopped moving while I was stuck in this limbo, caught between a past that had shattered and a future that was still completely undefined. I eventually found myself pulling into a small diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, but it still seemed like the perfect place to get some air. It wasn't too crowded, and I needed a break from my own head. As I entered, the smell of coffee and fried food hit me. I walked to the counter and took a seat, trying to ignore the knot that still twisted in my stomach. The waitress came over quickly, a polite smile on her face. "What can I get you?" "Coffee," I said, my voice rough, like I hadn't spoken in days. "Black." She nodded and went off to pour my drink. I sat there, staring into the mug once she returned, watching the steam curl up from the hot liquid. It wasn't even the warmth of the coffee that soothed me. It was the solitude, the quiet, the brief escape from everything that had been overwhelming me. The buzz of the door opening broke the silence, and I looked up, half expecting to see someone familiar, someone who might offer me comfort. But it was just a couple of patrons, chatting in low voices as they grabbed a booth. The place was still too quiet. Too peaceful. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt more isolated than ever. My mind kept returning to Lisa, to the fact that everything between us was a lie. For years, I had been living in a fantasy, thinking everything was fine, thinking I was the man she needed. But in the end, she had chosen someone else. The reality was harsh and undeniable, and no amount of coffee or solitude was going to change that. I stared at the mug in my hand, gripping it tightly as if it could ground me. As if it could somehow prevent the flood of emotions from consuming me again. But the truth was there, sharp and unforgiving. I could still hear her voice in my head, coldly telling me that she was done. There was no going back. The waitress returned, placing the bill on the counter without saying a word. I hadn't even noticed her watching me. I reached into my pocket, pulling out some cash, but my hand was shaking. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours was crushing me, and the thought of facing it all again, of having to go back to the house, to confront the empty space she'd left behind, felt like too much to bear. I paid quickly and left the diner, not bothering to take a moment to gather myself. Outside, the cold night air hit me hard, and I welcomed it. It was the only thing that could clear my head. I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore, but I knew I couldn't stay stuck in this place forever. I had to move forward. Somehow. Even if I didn't know how. I drove aimlessly again, this time heading toward the beach. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was calming, and I parked the car near the sand, the dark sky above reflecting the emptiness I felt inside. The headlights of my car illuminated the horizon, but it still felt like I was lost in the vastness of it all. There was no guide, no direction, no one to tell me what came next. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the water. I thought about Lisa, about everything that had happened. What had gone wrong? Where had it all started? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in this state of limbo, waiting for something that would never come. I couldn't wait for her to change her mind. I couldn't wait for her to apologize for the lies, for the deceit. She had already made her decision, and I had to respect that, even if it hurt. Even if it didn't feel fair. The truth was that I had been living for her, for the idea of us, for something that no longer existed. I had neglected my own happiness, my own needs, in favor of keeping up the illusion that everything was fine. Now, I was left with nothing. But something inside me shifted, just slightly. I could no longer keep holding on to what was gone. It was like carrying an anchor around my neck, dragging me down with every passing second. The only way forward was to let go. To accept that this chapter of my life was over. There would be no turning back. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the water, the cold sand slipping beneath my shoes. The waves rolled in, steady and relentless, like the reality I was facing. Each wave crashing against the shore seemed to match the pulse in my veins, the anger, the sadness, the confusion, all blending together in a torrent of emotions I didn't know how to deal with. But as I stood there, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean, something inside me started to shift. It was small at first, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. The ocean, with its quiet rhythm, seemed to remind me that life moved forward, whether I was ready or not. And maybe that was all I needed to do, to move forward. Even if I didn't know what lay ahead. I took a deep breath and let the cold air fill my lungs, steadying myself. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I had to keep going. I wasn't going to let this defeat me. Lisa had made her choice, and I had to make mine. It was time to take control. It was time to rebuild. I turned back to the car, feeling the weight lifting, just a little. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I could take the first step. The cold wind whipped around me as I stood there, staring out over the dark waters, the sound of the crashing waves echoing in my mind. The feeling of emptiness still gnawed at me, but I had to admit, there was something about this moment, this place, that made me feel less lost than I had been in days. It was a small sense of clarity amidst the chaos, like the eye of a storm. I didn't have answers, but the silence of the beach gave me room to breathe. It made me realize that, no matter what had happened with Lisa, there was life beyond this heartbreak. There had to be. I turned back toward the car, my shoes crunching against the sand, and as I slid into the driver's seat, a thought occurred to me. I had been so focused on the pain, on the anger, on the betrayal. But I had never stopped to consider what came next. What I needed. It was as if I had lost sight of myself somewhere along the way, buried under the weight of the relationship that had been my entire world. I started the engine, the sound of the car filling the empty space, but it wasn't the roar of the engine that brought me comfort, it was the fact that I was in control again. For the first time in what felt like years, I was the one driving the car, metaphorically and literally. I wasn't waiting for someone else to fix it, or to tell me what to do. It was up to me. And that realization, no matter how small, felt like a weight was being lifted from my chest. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from everything that reminded me of her, the empty house, the silence that lingered like a ghost. I needed a change of scenery, something new, something that would help me start to piece myself back together. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and quiet, and I found myself driving toward the mountains. I wasn't sure what it was about the mountains, but there was something comforting in the idea of them. They were solid, unmovable, and I needed that. I needed to feel anchored again, like I wasn't just drifting through life waiting for someone else to take the lead. The further I drove, the more I felt the tightness in my chest loosen, and by the time I reached the base of the mountain, I felt a little calmer. I parked the car at the trailhead, the crisp night air greeting me as I stepped outside. There was something about the mountains at night, something still and quiet, as though they held ancient secrets that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I wanted to be around that kind of peace, away from everything I had known. Away from the noise of the world that had been drowning me in frustration. The hike up the trail was slow, deliberate. With every step I took, I felt more disconnected from the chaos that had consumed my life. There were no texts, no calls, no reminders of the mess Lisa had left behind. There was just me and the path ahead. I wasn't sure if I was running away from my pain or if I was just finding a new way to process it, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was moving forward. I reached the top of the mountain an hour later, the air thinner, cooler. The view was breathtaking, with the sprawling city lights far below, their glow a faint shimmer against the dark sky. But what stood out the most was the sky itself. It was clear, almost surreal in its expanse. There were no clouds, no distractions, just endless stars scattered across the dark canvas of the universe. For the first time in a long time, I felt small. But not in a way that made me feel insignificant. I felt small in a humbling way. It was as if the universe was reminding me that everything, all of my problems, was just a tiny blip in the grand scheme of things. I stood there for a long while, just breathing in the cold air, taking in the view, letting the silence surround me. My phone was in my pocket, buzzing with notifications, but I ignored it. I didn't want to deal with anyone right now. I didn't want to hear anyone's opinion on what I should do next. This was my time. I needed to be alone with my thoughts, to start to make sense of everything that had happened. After some time, I sat down on a rock and pulled out the small flask of whiskey I had brought with me. It burned as it went down, but it was a welcome kind of burn. It felt like I was cleansing myself, like I was shedding the layers of anger, betrayal, and doubt that had been suffocating me. It wasn't the solution, but it was a start. I didn't need to fix everything right away. For the first time in weeks, I realized that it was okay to just be. To feel the pain, to feel the anger, but to also allow myself the space to move through it without trying to escape. As the minutes turned into hours, the sky above shifted. The stars seemed to get brighter, more vivid, and I felt a flicker of something inside me stir. It was hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that made everything feel perfect, but the kind of hope that made me believe that there could be life after this. That even though Lisa had walked away, I could still rebuild. I didn't know when I would go back to the house. I didn't know when I'd face Lisa again, or if I ever would. But I knew that I was starting to regain my sense of self, and that was the first step. There would be days ahead when I'd feel weak, when the anger would surge again, but I was beginning to understand that I didn't need to hold on to the bitterness. I didn't need to carry it with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. And that, more than anything else, was the start of something new. The morning sun had barely risen when I made my way down the mountain. The hike down was easier, almost meditative in its simplicity. My mind, though still tangled with thoughts of Lisa, felt clearer now. I had spent hours at the peak of that mountain, contemplating, processing, but more than anything, I had spent that time letting go. It wasn't easy, and I knew it wasn't over. There would be moments when the pain would return, when the memories of her would resurface like a tidal wave, but I also knew I was starting to reclaim my own life. A life that wasn't defined by her or our failed marriage. The drive back into the city felt different. I didn't feel as lost as I had before, but I wasn't fully healed either. There was still much to face, much to unpack, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a sense of direction. I wasn't sure what the next steps would be. Maybe they would be small steps, like finding a new routine, or maybe they would be bigger, like cutting all ties with Lisa. But I knew I had a choice, and that felt empowering. I arrived back at the house, the place that had once felt like home but now felt like a hollow shell of everything I had once believed in. I stood at the door for a moment, my hand resting on the handle. There was still so much anger, so much pain, but I knew if I kept living in this house, surrounded by the memories of what had been, I would only keep holding on to the past. I needed to create a future. A future that didn't include her. A future where I could rebuild, start fresh, and move on. The first thing I did when I entered the house was take a deep breath and walk into the kitchen. I had left a few things scattered around from the night Lisa had left, the remnants of our life together. I found an old photo of the two of us, smiling, happy, before the lies, before the affair, before everything had fallen apart. I picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and then, without a second thought, I tossed it in the trash. That small act, that seemingly insignificant gesture, was the first step in letting go. I didn't need to keep reminders of a life that no longer existed. I didn't need to keep holding on to a version of her that wasn't real. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone who didn't respect me, who had no qualms about betraying me. I walked through the house, opening drawers, looking through old papers, clearing out anything that reminded me of her. I didn't need the past. I needed to make space for a new life, for a future that was all mine. It wasn't easy. Every step I took felt like I was erasing a part of myself. But that was the thing, I had to erase the version of me that had been tethered to her. I had to make room for the version of me that could thrive on his own. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me to this point. The relationship had started off so beautifully, so perfectly. We had been happy once, or so I thought. We had plans, dreams, and a future together. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the man she needed. I had become complacent, wrapped up in my own world, assuming that love would always be enough. But love wasn't enough when trust was broken, when respect was lost, when someone decided that their own happiness was more important than the vows they had taken. I had been blind, but that blindness had been a defense mechanism. I hadn't wanted to see the cracks in our relationship, the little things that Lisa had hidden from me. But now, standing in this empty house, I could see it all clearly. The lies, the neglect, the betrayal. I wasn't angry at myself anymore for not seeing it sooner. I was angry at the way I had allowed myself to stay in something that wasn't real. I had stayed because I was afraid of the alternative. But now, I realized that the alternative was freedom. The alternative was letting go of a person who had no interest in being there for me. I stopped for a moment, leaning against the counter, and took a deep breath. It felt strange, clearing the house of everything that had once belonged to her. It felt like I was shedding a skin I had been wearing for years, a skin that had been suffocating me. The past had a hold on me, but with each passing minute, I felt like I was freeing myself from it. I wasn't sure what would happen next. Maybe I would go back to work, focus on my career, focus on myself. Maybe I would try to find new friendships, new connections. But one thing was certain, I wouldn't let this define me. I wouldn't let her define me. As I stood in the center of the living room, the emptiness around me felt strangely comforting. This house, once filled with the memories of our life together, was now just a shell. It was a shell I was ready to leave behind. I didn't know when or how, but I was determined to move on. I would take my time, heal at my own pace, but I wouldn't let the past keep me anchored to a life that no longer served me. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, determined to find a new direction. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, I knew I would be okay. I wasn't the man I had been before, but that wasn't a bad thing. I was becoming the man I was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The car's engine hummed beneath me as I drove down the familiar streets, but nothing felt the same anymore. I was no longer the man who had once filled these roads with the hope of a shared future, a future that had unraveled in front of my eyes. But there was something in the way the city looked now, the quiet hum of the morning, the soft light filtering through the trees, that told me it was time to move forward. It wasn't just about finding a new life, it was about discovering who I was outside of the man who had been married to Lisa. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, my identity, and my sense of purpose. I had spent so much time focusing on her, on the relationship we had, the promises we made, the life we built together, that I had forgotten how to live for myself. The past few weeks had been a blur of heartache and rage, but now, standing on the other side of it, I could see clearly. I wasn't just a victim of betrayal. I was a person who had been stuck, who had forgotten how to live without someone else's approval. But now, I was free. Free to make decisions that were right for me. Free to choose a path that was mine, and mine alone. As I turned the corner, I found myself heading toward the small cafe I used to visit in the mornings before everything had changed. It was a place I hadn't been in months, not since Lisa and I had stopped going together. At the time, it had felt like one more of the many routines we shared, one more piece of our life that I thought was unbreakable. But now, it was just me. And somehow, that felt liberating. I parked the car and got out, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. The cafe was quiet, with just a few people sitting at tables, sipping their coffee, lost in their own worlds. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world go by. For a moment, I allowed myself to just be. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the sound of my thoughts and the quiet hum of life moving around me. As I sat there, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The heartbreak, the rage, the moments of despair, they had all been real, but they had also been part of a process. A process of self-discovery, of healing, of letting go. I had once been terrified of what would happen if I let go of Lisa. I had convinced myself that I needed her to be whole. But the truth was, I had never been broken. I had simply been lost. And now, I was finding myself again. The coffee was warm, and as I took a sip, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. I didn't need perfection. I needed to move forward. I needed to live for myself. When I finished my coffee, I paid the bill and left, stepping out into the sunlight. I wasn't sure what the next steps were, but I knew I was ready to face them. It wasn't about moving on quickly or pretending that the pain didn't matter. It was about accepting that life goes on, with or without the people who were once a part of it. As I drove back home, I thought about the house, the empty rooms, the memories that still lingered in the corners of every space. I wasn't ready to sell it yet. I wasn't ready to part with it completely. But I knew it was time to make it mine again. To reclaim the space that had once been shared, to transform it into a place that reflected who I was now. The process would take time, but I was ready for it. I wasn't afraid of the work it would take to make it feel like home again. I was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant making changes I hadn't yet imagined. That night, I sat down with a notebook and began to write. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense. It wasn't about recording my thoughts and feelings in a continuous stream. It was more like a blueprint, a map of who I wanted to be, who I needed to be. I wrote down goals, things I wanted to achieve, things I wanted to feel. I wrote about the kind of man I wanted to become, not the one who had been defined by someone else, but the one who could stand on his own. The one who had the strength to let go of the past and embrace the future. I didn't expect it to be easy. I didn't expect all the pain to disappear overnight. But I knew one thing for certain, I was no longer afraid. I was no longer afraid of being alone, of facing the unknown, of walking away from a chapter that had been filled with lies. Because in that moment, I realized that the next chapter was mine to write. The following days were filled with small changes. I started exercising again, something I hadn't done in months. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I had neglected when I was so wrapped up in my marriage. I even signed up for a class on photography, something I had always wanted to try but had never had the time for. It wasn't about making big, dramatic moves. It was about taking small steps toward rebuilding myself. Toward living a life that was centered around me, not anyone else. I knew there would be hard days ahead. There would be moments when the memories of Lisa would surface, when the pain of what we had lost would feel too heavy to bear. But I also knew that I had the strength to face those moments, to push through them, and to keep moving forward. As I stood in front of the mirror that night, I looked at the man staring back at me. He wasn't the man I had been when Lisa and I were together. He was different. Stronger. More self-aware. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled at the reflection. I was proud of the man I had become. Proud of the choices I was making. Proud that I was no longer living in the shadow of someone else's expectations. I didn't need her. I didn't need anyone to define who I was. I was enough on my own. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to walk into it, no matter what it held.